everyone. Welcome back to this week's Ecosystem Podcast. Today, I've asked Matt Haber of Cofactr to join me today and tell you about things that he's doing to help engineers like you stay ahead of all these crazy tariffs and compliance issues that we're seeing across the industry. We talk about what's happening across the industry and globally and how Cofactr is working to give you that data in real time to help you control your costs and your sourcing, both here in the United States and abroad. Now let's jump into our conversation with Matthew Haber, co-founder of Cofactr. Hi, Matt. So good to have you again on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today. For those who may have missed some of our other podcasts, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Cofactr?
Thanks for having me, Judy. I am Matthew Haber. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cofactr. Cofactr is a supply chain execution platform for critical manufacturing, and specifically, we work a lot in electronics and with electronics manufacturers to help them, automate and optimize how they procure and manage their electronic components.
Well, sounds easy enough when you say it that way, but right now, as you know, the U.S. shifting trade policies and tariffs that is getting not only us as people in the industry, but global markets feeling insecure. I thought this was an excellent time to have you on to dig into that a little bit deeper. So, from your perspective and having the platform you do and having intelligent data to help people make these decisions, how do you address all the uncertainty that we're finding ourselves in regards to tariffs right now?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying that it has never been a kind of more volatile and uncertain time for manufacturers when it comes to global trade and tariffs. Obviously, there have been plenty of periods in history where there are more or fewer tariffs, but I think the rate at which the tariff environment is changing these days is pretty unique. And so it certainly demands kind of a different approach to how manufacturers think about these issues, right? And I think the big one is anyone who tells you that they can solve these problems for you is lying, right? Like the reality is uh everything's changing really quickly. There's no magic bullet to how you solve all of that. Um but what you need to be able to do is rapidly respond to these changes so that you can most effectively and efficiently manage them in the moment as they change, right? And so one of the ways that Cofactr helps is to provide manufacturers with tools that let them uh, clearly understand what are the impacts going to be every time the sort of environment changes, right? So we have no control over the tariff environment. There's nothing we can do to change any of that, right? But when the countries that are subject to tariff changes or the amounts and commodity classes to which those tariffs are applied changes, um, manufacturers need to understand, of the dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of unique items that are used across all of my products. Um, where are they coming from? What are the country of origins of all these parts, so that I can understand whether or not tariffs apply to them? Um, what type of commodity are they? So I can also understand the applicability of different tariffs to them, and which products do I use them in? How much do I pay for them? Like all the kind of that information. You need to be able to understand all that in one place. That doesn't involve a bunch of people running off and scrambling in spreadsheets, because by the time you finish your spreadsheet scramble, the situation probably has changed again, and you're gonna have to go back and start all over. So I think that's really where we can come in.
So, Matthew, I actually saw your team. I was at IPC Apex in Anaheim yesterday, and I saw your team. I saw Shane Whiteside, who's the CEO of Summit Interconnect Technologies, and some other executives. And the conversations around tariffs were on everybody's lips, which is why I wanted to have you on. Um, and as you said, tariffs aren't new, but the rate and the volatility is certainly a challenge, and I'm sure it's a challenge for people in our audience. So, give us a sense. I mean, obviously, they're changing. It seems like day to day. Maybe I'm over exaggerating, but I met with the executive director of PCBAA yesterday, who's advocating on Capitol Hill for U.S. manufacturing. And what he said is, he said the market doesn't like uncertainty. Washington, D.C. doesn't like uncertainty. And if I dare speak for our audience, I don't think engineers and electronics companies like this kind of uncertainty. So how do we gain that agility right now? And I know, you guys are kind of in the thick of it as really looking at this with a modern, um, using great data intelligence to give that, near real time feedback. So what exactly does that mean and what does it look like?
Yeah. So I think there's really like a few key inputs you need to understand what are the tariff implications, right? I mentioned them earlier, but it's like country of origin, so we call commodity class, which is like you should call them HTS or an HTS US code. Um, and then price of the item and like how many of them you're importing and when, right? Like those are really the factors. Um, and so the starting point is if you're a manufacturer, you need to know those things, those pieces of information about every single item that goes into your product, not just your finished product, but the resistors, the chips, the nuts and bolts, every last little bit of it, right? And you can't really do anything more sophisticated until you have that kind of basic foundation figured out. And um, what we see is that most manufacturers traditionally haven't really had to worry that much about that stuff, and so a lot of people just have really big gaps in their information about those like really key pieces of information. And so there's like two kind of ways you can get that that Cofactr helps with. One of them is you can just go to someone who already has a database of a bunch of that information. And so like in Cofactr's case, we have country of origin data and HGS data on tens of millions of electronic components. And so if you put in a bomb, for a lot of the parts, we're just going to know all that information right off the bat. You don't have to do any work to have that information. And there are other companies, in the electronic component data space that have some of that data as well and can do something similar there. Um, there's still going to be some gaps though. Parts that you get made custom, maybe your PCBAs, your bare boards, right? Things like that, that like there's not going to be a data source out there that tells you what that information is because it's specific to you ultimately, right? Now maybe
Mhm.
you know the answers for some of that yourself, you know who you work with and where they make the stuff, but um, what we find is often manufacturers, especially at a bigger scale, don't really have all that in one spot. We have a bunch of tools that lets you sort of go and find that information in materials you might already have. So for example, manufacturers often include that information on invoices, on packing slips, on other kinds of like transaction commercial documents, as we call that. Um, and Cofactor has a bunch of like AI products that can basically just like go look at a giant folder of documents, read all of them,
Mm.
pull all that kind of information off of them, and then kind of update your part library with that information for you. And so that can be a really powerful tool um, to to essentially like go in without too much labor, collect a lot of that information that manufacturers might already have hidden somewhere, but it's not sort of readily accessible and usable. So once you have all that information, that's when you can have to start to do stuff with it to understand, okay, the country of origin hasn't changed, the commodity code hasn't changed, but as of today, there's 25% tariffs on this combination of commodity codes and country of origin. What does that do to my cost structure, right? Um, and then you can start to play with it. So you can say, like, well, what happens if I swap out some of those parts for different ones with different countries of origin? Is that worth it? Does it change my cost structure in a way that is sort of beneficial? So Cofactor kind of is useful both to get that data to begin with, but then also we have this very sort of fast dynamic platform where you can load in a bunch of BOM data, either from spreadsheets or by integrating with products like Altium or various product lifecycle management tools that engineers may already be using. So we could pull in all that engineering data, and then we can make it very easy to kind of play with different scenarios and say, well, okay, what happens if I, change how many of my bonds I'm making, or add these alts that are from a different country, or swap around these different, components, and what does that do to my cost? I can analyze that quickly. And also, if I show up tomorrow and the tariff regime is different, I don't have to start from scratch. All I have to do is look, basically. And the information is going to be, reflect tomorrow's reality when it's different from today. And so it also is like gives you a much quicker way to figure that out versus kind of a traditional spreadsheet driven kind of tariff analysis that's going to take, days, weeks, months, years in some cases, yeah, as we've seen sometimes, to try to figure that information out.
So, as far as your tool goes, I don't know honestly if I've ever seen sort of your dashboard or what it looks like. So, can you give us an idea? Well, I have 2 questions. So, give us an idea of what it actually looks like if you're driving the tool and where. somebody would find country of origin sourced inside of your tool that makes this accessible and helpful.
Yeah. Um, Basically, anytime you look at a bomb, an individual part, or what we call programs, which are essentially like work orders or builds or jobs. You kind of think of them in different ways, but like it's sort of the manufacturing intent around one or more bombs. Um, there's just going to be a column that you can turn on for country of origin. And it's just going to be, like I said, it's kind of pre-filled magically for you. You don't really have to do any additional work. So it's just going to be right there. And then you can start to filter and kind of slice and dice around that. And so I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the views in Cofactor look kind of like a sort of magical spreadsheet that fills itself in for you and has nicer color coding and also has some nice charts and graphs, right? So it's a pretty familiar interface for folks. Um,
Okay.
but with a lot more smarts. And when you want to understand, why does it say that in that cell, for example, with a spreadsheet, you have to go try to figure out why it says that in the cell. Go back to you can probably click and it'll, expand and give you more detailed information about the supply chain condition or things like that.
So, how do users know that like, where are you pulling you talked about pulling data from files and things like that, but how can users of your platform actually rely and are feel very comfortable that whatever that tariff is today is updated and it's good and they could rely upon it?
Um, I get data from a bunch of spots, and we have a whole data engineering and data quality team at Cofactor that works on that exact problem.
I see.
Um, so when we look at country of origin data from electronic component manufacturers, for example, generally coming from the electronic component manufacturer. So we're not just like guessing we think this chip is made in Taiwan. We're pulling that off of materials, things like product change notifications, data sheets, compliance documents that are made available by the component manufacturers themselves. And so those tend to be a pretty reliable source of information. Um, there's a lot of supply chain volatility right now. Folks sometimes are moving factories. Many manufacturers do a good job about publishing product change notifications that we can then use to make sure that's up to date. Some don't. Some try to actually obscure that. So it's an imperfect situation, but it's going to be like vastly better than trying to do it by hand. Um, and that's also where the commercial document side of it is really valuable. Um, Distributor websites that list country of origin aren't always right. They're operating off of sometimes old data. They're
Okay.
pretty good, but it's like not perfect. But the packing slip that comes for a specific piece of materials in this country of origin, that's going to be correct. That's like essentially a legal document, and you really can't lie to customs about what country of origin is. And so like those tend to be correct. And so one of the benefits of our approach, where we also kind of pull this invoice data, this packing slip data, these other kind of like transaction data sources, is those tend to be extremely accurate for the parts that manufacturers are actually using. And so that's like really valuable as a data source to ensure a high degree of accuracy, across that kind of like information set.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is, one, you're pulling it from actual documentations of your customers as well as component manufacturers, not
That's right.
distributors, and you have data analysts inside making sure. So you've got several checks and balances in place that's going to help them. Now, since I was meeting with Eurocrossen, who is part of a brokerage in Norway that's called Confidi, and I was telling her a little bit about Cofactor, and she was, like, thinking like a board person. She's like, "I get it on components, but like you said, from a broker," she goes, "This is a big part of our thing that we have to track all the time is the country of origin because you may be buying it from a distributor in Germany, but it's made in China." And so she was asking about that. So when you talk about the PCB or the PCBA, can the customer add that in to their
Yes.
data and then they kind of own the reliability of that line item or whatever inside? Like, how does that get stitched together?
Yeah, that's right. So Cofactor is a what we call like a supply chain execution platform, right? So we're not just like a data provider where you go and look at the data we have. We're a tool that people use to manage these workflows internally. And so that's right. They're gonna have a whole bunch of parts in Cofactor that might be PCBA, might be PCAs, might be enclosures, might be hardware, might be
Mhm.
anything that can go into their finished assembly.
Okay.
And that data they can put in manually, or it can come from like other engineering tools, product lifecycle management software, their ERP, et cetera, right? So yeah, that's all going to be in Cofactr. And when it comes to country of origin data, proactively, we won't know, right? Like that's they can enter that themselves.
Right.
But again, like if they purchased it in the past from a supplier, and they have documentation from that supplier, like in a big
Right.
folder somewhere, essentially, and that can be like a physical folder or a virtual folder. Um, the system can like use that document AI processing to pull that information off of the document. So they might not have to go in and manually type in, I get
Okay.
my PCBs made in China. We can look and see like, well, we see
Right.
that there's a document with this part number and the country of origin is China, and that's
Right.
clearly where you're getting it. So we can set that for you, and based on your own information that like might not be conveniently accessible to you. And that's again really valuable because often, especially at kind of medium to large companies, the people who have access to all of that traditional compliance and transaction information
Right.
might not be the same people who are trying to figure out what tariff implications are. And so it can be really useful as a way to kind of like hoover up all that finance data, but actually use it to unlock a bunch of really powerful, like, tariff modeling capabilities.
Very interesting. I like that you can provide some heft and insight if you have access, through your tool to, like you said, suck up that information and pull it in. But they could also look at it for those commercial off the shelves or those custom things that Cofactor is not going to pull in. Um, so how is this? I'll need you to educate both me and our listeners. Who is typically responsible? Say your customers are mostly like mid-tier electronics manufacturers, let's say, generally. And who would be normally own the responsibility for finding the country of origin? Is it the engineers that is in our audience? Is it a buyer? Is it a global procurement or compliance person? Like, who owns that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like this is a lot of the challenge the industry has right now, which is that like traditionally no one owned it. Like it was basically, unless you had like a global trade department, which like really owned it, like, but that's very unusual, other than at kind of much larger companies.
Uh-huh.
Um, what we see is like a lot of folks have been very responsive or reactive about this versus kind of proactive, where no one was identifying that proactively. When you go to import something, the shipper was just putting the information that needed to be put on the shipping documents, and then you get a bill from your customs broker for some amount that you may or may not have expected, when those materials come through customs. All of a sudden people are realizing that like that's not going to work, right? And so I think like generally we see supply chain folks having to take this on. We see material managers or like, material people on the sort of inventory side in some cases having to take this on. Sometimes component engineering is starting to take this on because they're kind of responsible for like library data management. And this
Right.
is just like another data point that all of a sudden they care about. Um,
Right.
Again, some companies do have like kind of dedicated compliance or global trade folks or teams, like that might fall to them. But even when it does, I would say like generally global trade teams or compliance teams don't actually know how to figure out the country of origin for a bunch of electronic components, right? Like they tend to be better at doing things like classification and those sorts of issues. But like sort of data research isn't necessarily within their skill set when you look at these kinds of materials that like there's a very high number of bomb lines in electronics, right? Like that's a challenge is you're trying to figure this out not for like a few important commodities, which is often what a global trade team is good at. You're trying to figure it out for like a ton of commodities, like a million lines across all your bombs. That's just really, really hard for humans to keep up with.
Right. And I mean, because of my limited exposure, my thought is, well, either the person that designs a circuit at a schematic level, or maybe the design engineer is touching the components, but that's not the whole system, right? And so I can see how maybe multiple people are touching this critical point. Are you seeing now with these tariffs that this has become more of a hot button? Because it seems like it would have major cost implications that might throw people into some panic right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you think back like a year or two, and unless you were in like a really regulated industry where you had like very specific rules about what countries you could buy parts from, mostly people just didn't really care that much about it. I mean, even with the kind of last round of tariffs on imports from China, people kind of acclimated to those pretty quickly and then kind of went back to not caring anymore. It was sort of my experience of it. And I think now, because of how quickly it's changing, and also because of the impact of not having the free trade between Canada, the US, Mexico, or sort of
Yeah.
sometimes we have that, sometimes we don't these days. But like, deep uncertainty about whether or not we're going to continue to have North American free trade, that is, uh, I think, has prompted a like renewed and significantly increased sense of awareness,
Urgency.
urgency, and
Awareness.
awareness that like you really have to actually pay attention to this stuff and get ahead of it, not just like hope it doesn't bite you later.
Right. And it's changing so fast. So I think what's intriguing about your tool is being able to have multi points of reliable data that can say, yeah, no, this is the country of origin and get that updated, regularly and have access to that data. I think it's so fascinating how much good data intelligence is becoming critical on many fronts right now. It always has been, but like you said, it seems somewhat forgettable.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, the faster the world moves, the more impossible it is to rely on manual processes. It's just like the reality of it, right? Like if these legal regimes change every couple years or every several years, maybe a manual process is going to cut it. Like maybe that's okay,
Right,
and you can live in spreadsheets because you have some time to kind of be responsive to things. When things are changing every day, every week, every month, a manual process is going to be wrong by the time it's done, and
right,
so you just can't do it. Like that's not a functional way to run a manufacturing business. You have to have a lot more automation and a lot more data intelligence around the stuff to have any shot at keeping up, right? So it has nothing to do with kind of skill or, aptitude or attitude. It just has to do with like the reality of like, I know more about this stuff than most people and I couldn't do it manually. No one else is gonna be able to either, right? Like,
right. And I think it's not just the speed, which is the speed at which the landscape's changing, but also the complexity of electronics
right.
because of AI and data centers is like off the chain. Everybody's telling me, kind of across the industry, people who I know that are operating at the highest levels are like, we've never, people my age are saying we've never seen it move this fast. It's like 4x what it normally has been because of the onslaught of AI data centers. And then on top of all the tariffs, then there's this push towards reshoring or people investing billions in the states. And yeah, what a mess. And how great, like to be sitting where you're sitting and sort of be in this place and to help companies sort of give them this insight so they can make these quick decisions. And I imagine that there's opportunities because we do operate in a global supply chain today and it's changing all the time that you may be hit by multiple tariffs, right, on several fronts. And is that I
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think like the thing about tariffs is they usually come in at least pairs, right? Which is like if a country levies tariffs against another country, typically the country against which the tariffs were levied is going to come out with retaliatory tariffs. Doesn't might not apply to all the same commodity classes, right? Like there's a bunch of variety there, but you end up often with kind of like what we call a tariff stack up, meaning like as the item moves from country to country, it accrues additional tariffs that can end up adding up to quite a lot, right? And I think that's where, for example, tariffs between the US, Canada, and Mexico are quite different in their impact than tariffs, between China and the US. Because I think like traditionally, when we look at the sort of East Asia, US supply chains, they tend to be like fairly one directional for electronics, which is say like mostly some amount of electronic assembly happens in China, and then the finished parts, just at some stage, the parts come to the US. They don't go back to China after that, right? Like
right,
they're mostly coming here, whatever the tariffs are, let's say it's 25%, you pay the 25% tariffs when they come into the US. And so your tariff burden is 25% on those materials, right? Because there's been such a long period of free trade between the North American countries, um, a lot of supply chains have built up that treat those borders as fairly sort of inconsequential. And so you have
Mm.
supply chains that sort of like hop between US, Canada, US, Mexico, Canada, Mexico, US, whatever, back and forth
Mhm.
a whole bunch of times. You see this a lot in automotive, you see this a lot in aerospace, um, some degree in medical devices, where um, a given product cross back and forth a lot of times, and that's like uniquely challenging because they get hit with tariffs when they go into Mexico, and they hit with tariffs when they come back, and then they get tariffs when they go into Canada, and they get tariffs when they come back, right? And so potentially you end up with a tariff stack up where it's not just you're paying 25% tariffs on this item, you're paying like hundreds of percents of tariffs on this item because of the sort of like compounding effect of all of those tariffs. And so that's just like a new situation. We have not seen that uh, you know, in decades essentially, and we haven't really seen that since these kinds of supply chains got developed, because you would never develop these supply chains the way they've been built if you thought you were going to have tariffs in each of these countries, right? And so it's only because these supply chains have sort of been built under one kind of
Right.
geopolitical model,
Right.
and they're sort of uniquely ill suited to the current geopolitical climate. And so there's like a lot of trying to figure out what the heck is going on that has to happen around these issues.
It's crazy. Well, to cheer everybody up after that description that picture we've painted, do you have a, say, a optimistic use case or a customer Cofactor has worked with that maybe was able to access this data in a way that made a difference for them so we can kinda see what that would look like in real life?
Yeah, we have a customer we just helped out recently kind of around this issue. So they were manufacturing primarily in China, and fairly large manufacturer of uh, industrial equipment, essentially. And they had a fairly China and to some degree Mexico based manufacturing process, specifically for PCBA. Um, and so over the years, they'd accumulated a lot of inventory, like millions of dollars of inventory. At their EMS manufacturing sites in China and Mexico. Um, as the sort of nature of the work they were doing, their nature of their product mix, their kind of risk tolerance evolved, starting kind of like 2 years ago, they decided they wanted to move towards onshoring that PCBA back to the US. So reshoring it back to the US. It's not really back to the US. They probably never had it in the US to begin with, but they wanted to look at bringing it into the US. But the challenge they had was that they had all of this material in China and they owned it and Mexico, and they had to bring it into the US um, to transfer it to a new facility, essentially, right? And they didn't know what that was going to cost. So when they were doing all of this kind of like modeling, they can look and say like, well, a sea freight container or a bunch of air freight pallets or whatever for the materials, like we know what the shipping is going to cost, but we don't know what the bill we're going to get when it comes to customs is. And like
Mm,
as we think about the kind of like financial modeling of this really big consequential supply chain decision we have to make, there's this like huge unanswered question about like what's it actually going to cost? What is the bill we're going to get when these materials cross the border, right? And so it's something they've been struggling with for like a year and a half when they started working with Cofactor. And pretty much immediately, we were able to take some inventory information about what they had at these facilities, enrich it with country of origin data, enrich it with HTS data, and just tell them, like, hey, here's what the bill's going to be. They were able to like have certainty and concreteness around that number, do their business decisions around it, decide that makes sense, pull those materials through. Those are now in the US in one of Cofactor's warehouses. And that was like that whole process was able to be done in like a matter of weeks. Actually, the Cofactor part was able to be done in about a day. And
wow.
then the rest of it, was a matter of weeks. And so we were able to take what was sort of like a slowly progressing, really painful, like year plus long process and just turn it into like kind of immediate answers that they could then, make the right business decision, move forward, um, get their manufacturing lines restarted in the US and have a lot of like kind of certainty about what was going to happen
Right.
because they just had the right information to operate off of.
I think a lot of companies, I mean, between post-COVID and supply chain insecurity, and now with these tariffs going in, I'm positive. Well, I could hear it yesterday on the floor of IPC Apex. It's like it's on everybody's lips right now. So I know for a fact, and not only here, but in Europe, when I had dinner with my friend Euro from Confidi, like it's on everybody's mind. So it's really amazing to learn about that you have that ability in your tool and what a great value add. I know that you're going to be doing, I saw your team at Apex yesterday, and they were telling me that you guys are getting ready to do a webinar with a partner. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then I'll share that. So if our listeners want to go learn more, they can go join your webinar
Yeah.
and learn more.
Yeah, I'm excited about this webinar to attend. I'm not the one hosting it, but it we talked a bunch today about kind of Cofactor's data and sort of process management capabilities. But we're definitely not like a global trade management platform, right? Like we don't deal with customs paperwork and filing and those kinds of things. Um, we're sort of more of a procurement and kind of engineering data management platform. And so,
Mhm.
this company that we are hosting this webinar with is more on that kind of like global trade, shipping management, customs
Mm.
management, automation side of the software stack, which I think is a really cool complement and like exciting
Yeah.
complement to the Cofactor platform. Um, and so, I think we're going to be talking kind of a lot during the webinar about a lot of sort of the tactical process automation stuff manufacturers can do to just solve these problems, with Cofactor kind of bringing a lot of that kind of upstream perspective to it. And then
Right.
our partner focusing on just sort of the like customs execution, shipping execution side of the problem space.
This is great. It's great information, and I love that you have this upstream partner that's gonna bring that kind of visibility. So, well, Matthew, I know you're growing, Cofactor is growing like crazy, and you're very busy, but I really appreciate this meaningful conversation, and I'll be sure to get with your team, Libby or Philip, and get that link. So, if listeners here wanna learn more about it, they can certainly dig in deeper instead of just hearing the highlights here on a podcast. But thank you again for being generous with your time and your knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure as always.
To our listeners, please go check out the show notes. By the time we get this live, I'll have those links for you below. I hope this has been helpful and insightful for you to think about risks to your supply chain and ways that you can stay on top of this crazy geopolitical sort of storm we're in while we're trying to all figure out what we're doing around here. We will see you next week. Until then, remember to always stay connected to the ecosystem.